Before we dive into today's story, make sure you're subscribed and tell us in the comments where you're listening from. I love seeing how far these stories travel.
Look at him, always buying our forgiveness with cash, like he's running a charity, not a family, Claire snapped across the kitchen, and the way the room folded around that sentence, my mother's face dropping into her hands, my father's jaw hard as granite, my cousin Tom's polite cough turning into a laugh like a blade made every dollar I'd ever sent home feel like a coin thrown into a glass coffin. My name is Marcus Hale. I'm 38 and I grew up in Cleveland, Ohio. And I said it out loud then because the humiliation needed an anchor. People leaned in as if my confession might be contagious, and the light from the pendant over the table turned the wine into red accusation. They knew what I'd done: car repairs, rent for Aunt Janice, the emergency surgery that Claire never thanked me for because gratitude had never been her currency. And yet here she stood in a dress she'd picked out months ago, telling anyone who would listen that she'd finally outgrown the family fixer and didn't want me at her wedding. The sting in the kitchen wasn't just her words. It was the way my father's eyes slid away, the way Evelyn, my mother, patted her knee and said, "We just want what's best for Claire," as if best meant erasing the ledger that had my name written across it. The pattern had been small for a long while. A dropped invite, a late text replied with a curt emoji, a birthday brunch where I was forgotten until the check needed splitting. Economy-sized slights that ate away at me on night shifts and in fluorescent offices where men my age pretended not to notice the way I flinched when the subject turned to family. At work, Derek at the warehouse made jokes about me being the bank of the family and laughed when I didn't, and those jokes followed me back to a living room where Claire would say, "You can pay for my dress, but you can't buy a seat." And that line hung in my head like a lottery ticket I'd never scratched. I'd been proud, too proud, to believe paying the mortgage on her peace of mind would buy me a place at every table. The betrayal was quiet at first, a mold that spread under wallpaper, until the day it ate the frame clean. Escalations came in gentle increments that meant nothing when you're busy being the one who fixes the pipes. I wired deposits for vendors at Claire's insistence and saw vendors' receipts pop up in group photos later with my name neatly cropped from the captions. I sat through family dinners where Claire described seating plans and menu upgrades in a way that suggested I was an abstract concept, not a living, breathing relative with hands that ached from overtime. Once, after I covered a month's rent for my father when his part-time hours shrank, Claire said to a cousin with a delicate smirk, "Marcus always wants a medal for normal things," and the cousin clapped when she said it as if the applause could erase my checks. The exploitation was never announced with a trumpet. It was a steady, draining list of favors that Claire framed as charity, while making sure everyone knew she had chosen a better life now, one that apparently began where my name stopped being invited. But the breaking point was crystal clear, clean and cruel, at a family get-together meant to celebrate nothing more than the new china my mother had bought. Claire held up a printed wedding program and read it like an indictment, smirking as she ran her finger down every line and paused where my name should have been. "We wanted a small ceremony," she said, and the room took a slow breath as if drawn into a trap. "Marcus will understand." Understanding was not what I felt. The heat that rose in my chest was not anger so much as the recognition that everything I'd done had been catalogued and repurposed into proof that I owed them something beyond thanks, a proof they could hold up as justification for my erasure. Someone asked why I wasn't invited to the rehearsal. Someone else said, too softly, "We thought he'd appreciate being left out," and laughter exploded like glass. The rawness of that moment, my sister announcing my exclusion, like she was performing the small, tidy death of an obligation, shifted something in me. I tasted metal, the old trials of being a man who fixed things by hand and paid things by bank transfer, and realized my patience was not a virtue but a currency they spent without my consent. I walked out into the backyard because inside I would have either shouted or dissolved, and the cold night air hit my face like a dare. My phone buzzed with messages that were all polite symphonies of avoidance. I'd been taught to fix, to show up, to be the steady engine that kept this family's train on schedule, but for the first time, the engine felt like a trap. I could picture the ceremony. White aisle, people in rented smiles, Claire in a dress I'd financed without a receipt, music cued by a man whose invoice bore my name in black and white. That visual my dollars underwriting a celebration from which I was banished was the betrayal that could not be ignored, and in the gut of that betrayal something decisive formed. I would not be the invisible credit line that bankrolled someone else's happiness while they pronounced me unworthy. So I did the most radical, the most childish, and the most honest thing I could imagine. I wrote a check to cancel the final vendor payment and booked a seat in first class to an island I had never allowed myself to visit. The decision was private. I did not post it. I did not call my mother to explain. I simply watched the screen as my banking app confirmed the transfer back to me and felt the weight of it like a small liberation. The revenge was not a dramatic public trial. Revenge rarely is, but a reallocation of resources and dignity. The money I had set aside for a plastic moment, the flower arrangements, the string quartet, the professional photos became a plane ticket, a hotel that smelled of salt and citrus, a confirmation number that felt like a small personal victory typed into a black box. I left a note on the kitchen table that morning. "I'll see you someday." It was a lie and a promise, and the way Claire read it aloud to the group with a theatrical gasp was both a final insult and a free admission to my choice. What followed was a collapse written in whispers and forwarded texts. Vendors called the venue when the check bounced. The florist sent a terse email that ended in "Please advise." Claire's calm facade cracked into frantic messages that became public when someone, Tom, the cousin with a polite cough, forwarded her private panicked texts to a group chat with the snide subject line, "Family Drama." Suddenly, Claire, who had orchestrated my exclusion, was the one scrambling to find a replacement, bargaining on corners she had ignored for months. People who had cheered my absence now had to explain to strangers why the cake arrived half-baked, why the string quartet was replaced with a playlist someone's nephew DJ'd on a phone with terrible reception. My absence became a quiet scandal. Guests pushing chairs, bridesmaids whispering, the caterer making calls for a last-minute payment with a voice too loud in the chapel. The power balance didn't flip because I threw a tantrum. It reversed because I removed the invisible scaffolding they had been leaning on. That was the cruelty of my revenge, simple, precise, fiscal, and it stung more because it didn't require me to shout in the garden. It required me to step out of the show. On the beach, weeks later, I watched the sunrise smear gold across water and felt something like relief tide through my ribs. Luxury, I found, was not the cocktails or the king-size bed. but the small dignity of not answering to a group of people who had learned to refashion obligation into contempt. Texts came brittle, resentful. My mother called and left a message that tasted like guilt. Claire sent a photo of herself in a ruined veil, eyes rimmed with mascara and fury, and I realized the image she had tried to create of me as the villain had collapsed into a hurried, messy truth she could not tidy. I posted a single image from my trip, a photograph of my shoes in the sand, the ocean blurred beyond, captioned only with a plain emoji and the time. It was petty and perfect. Within hours, my phone cracked with voicemails from people who wanted to know where I got the money, and snippets of private conversations started to leak, vendors admitting they'd expected me to be the backstop. Claire's friends murmuring that she'd always been more comfortable in public triumph than private gratitude. At work, whispers about my absence turned to awkward sympathy and then faded. But the important thing was that inside me the weight had shifted. I was no longer the ledger, the checkbook with hands. The family who had learned to consume me with their silence and entitlement looked smaller from 4,000 miles away. Claire's wedding went on sort of. Photos showed cake half-eaten, an empty seat at the front row, people clinking glasses with the awkwardness of those who have been asked to pretend absence is presence. When the video of the ceremony circulated, there was a 30-second stretch where the officiant smiled into the camera, and then the video cut out, because the venue's internet had been cut when the bill remained unpaid. The footage looped back to Claire's mouth forming the vows, and then the sound dropped into a pin-drop silence that felt, to anyone watching, like a paused breath between accusation and consequence. I could have stayed silent forever, let the silence speak for me, but the final act of my revenge was not to gloat, but to hand them the mirror and walk away. On a Monday morning, I returned and walked into the living room where a handful of relatives still lingered, exhausted by the week of crisis they had choreographed. Claire stood there in a dress I recognized from those online pictures, wilted, as if joy had been replaced by the business of keeping a story alive. I placed on the table the last receipt from the travel agency, the confirmation of a hotel suite with ocean view, and when she looked up, I said one line that folded the whole thing into a clean, improbable truth. Every head turned, every conversation stuttered, and the silence that followed was not the polite kind, but the heavy kind that feels like a verdict. You invited everyone but the one who paid for the music. Enjoy the silence.
Betrayal leaves scars, but sometimes it also leaves lessons. What lesson did this story leave with you? Share it in the comments, and let's see how many of us have walked through the same kind of fire. And if you want more stories like this, make sure you're subscribed so you never miss the next one.